One of my favorite features in Excel is pivot tables. And pivot tables allow you to take complex data and break it into consumable chunks. And what we have here today is my 2018-2019 CPE schedule. And you'll see that we have a number of events and we have a lot of rebroadcasts or duplicate events. And there are a number of questions I need to ask myself about the schedule before I can say that it's done. The first thing that I need to know is how many individual distinct events do we have? And I could go through here and I could try to filter things out, and there are a number of ways I could do it in Excel, or I could just simplify my life and start using pivot tables. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to select my data. So I'm going to start up here in the upper left hand corner, and I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to hold my shift key and click in here and just select all of this data. So you can see the entire range is now selected. I'm going to go to insert and I'm going to select pivot chart. Now from pivot chart, you're going to have two options: pivot chart, which would just be a graph, and pivot chart and pivot table. For what I'm doing, I want to see a list of events. I need that table. If I clicked on pivot chart, I would just get a chart and my data would not look right, and we'll say a pie chart, for example. So I'm going to select this pivot chart and this pivot table, and I've got my data row selected, which is all of this. And then I'm going to go to my worksheet down here, and I want to create a new worksheet. So we're going to go ahead and do new worksheet. And I'm going to rename this worksheet, which it called sheet 8, just so I know what it is. I'm going to rename that to pivot. So now I have a pivot table and I have a pivot chart. For our needs, we don't need this chart, so I'm just going to select it and hit the delete key. Now it's gone. The next thing you'll know is when I click on my pivot table, I get my pivot fields, so my pivot table fields. And these pivot table fields here are going to directly impact this table. And I'm just going to take topics and I'm going to drag it down to rows. Now, alternatively, I could just click on topics and it's going to put it down there into the rows. It's going to try to figure out exactly where it goes, but I knew that I wanted topics in my rows. So we'll come back and look at this. Now it's important to note when I click outside of my pivot table, my pivot options go away. Inside, they're turned on. So what we have now is we have a list of events. If I go back to my original data, you'll see that I start on 1 and I go all the way down to 153, meaning I have 152 events. Here I start on 3 and I'm going to go all the way down to 67, meaning I have basically 63 events. So what it's done is it's taken all the duplicates out. So I'm going to come up here, I'm going to relabel this distinct events. So now I know that these are my distinct events. And this grand total box down here doesn't really make sense. We're not adding anything up. So I'm going to right click on that, go to my pivot table options, and I'm going to go to my totals and filters and turn these off. And I can hit OK, and that gets rid of that. There are a couple things that I do to make these prettier. You don't have to do this. I'm going to click on my top row. I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom row. I'm going to hold shift and I'm going to click, and that's going to highlight all my data. And then I'm going to format this as a table, and I'm going to use gray medium. And the reason that I use this, if you look at how this is laid out, it has highlights for the subtotals, and that's going to be important as we move on. So now what we have is we have a well-formatted list of all of the distinct events. But I also want to look at some other categories, so I'm going to go ahead and select this again. So using the same thing, click on the top, go down to the bottom, hit shift, and click. And I'm just going to select all of this, and I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to copy. Then I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to paste. Now, what you see is that we have two identical lists now. So what I've done is I've duplicated this pivot table. But what I want to look at now is locations. So we're going to go ahead and rename this. Right? So now it's locations, and I'm going to take topics out of my rows, and I'm going to move my CH column, which is my chapters, which would be my locations, down to my rows. And now I have a list of locations, but I'm going to move this credit over to here. So this is the sum of all credit. You can do anything you want to the value field over here in credits, right? If I wanted an average, I simply would click down, and at the very, very bottom of this list, it's actually off the screen, but at the very, very bottom of this list, you'll see field value settings. And those field value settings are going to open up this box here, which allows you to either do count, average, whatever you want to do, right? So you can go in and make those adjustments and change that. But for what we need is the total number of credits in each area. And I can see that Catawba has 64, Coastal has 60, Central has 224, and that's wonderful. Really what I needed to do here, right, is I needed to make sure that I had 40 hours of CPE in each one of these areas. Now, what I know, and you may not know because you're not looking at all of the different data sets, is I have lots of different formats or different types of CPE. So I'm going to go ahead and add a filter to this, and I'm going to take my filter, and I'm going to ensure that I'm meeting my obligations because I have to have 40 hours of live CPE in each one of these areas. So I'm only going to show events that are conferences or seminars. And now I can see that each chapter has 40 hours or more of CPE. And that's exactly what we were looking for. Okay? The next thing that I want to do is I want a little bit more detail about what that CPE is. So I'm going to take my type column and I'm going to drag it down here underneath of rows. And now what you see is I have Catawba with 40 hours total, and you can see each type of CPE that's in there. And on this particular one, I want my grand totals as well. So I'm going to come down here to the bottom. I'm going to right click, go back to my pivot table options, and I'm going to go ahead and turn my totals back on. So now I can see I have 416 total hours of CPE, of live CPE, and here's what the breakout is by area. For the time being, I want to turn this all back on, and now I can scroll down and I can see 640 total hours of CPE, including all formats. And if I want, I can simplify this and just minimize all of these, and I can come in anytime I want and see what's going on in each part of the state. So you can minimize or maximize these however you want to do that. We're going to go ahead and maximize these all back out so we can see all of our data. So we're going to take this entire pivot table, we're going to copy it, so select it all, we're going to copy that, come over here, we're going to paste it, and we've duplicated it again. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this by month. So we're going to do month, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my filter. So my filter is gone. And instead of having chapter here, we're going to want to have our month column. Now you'll notice when I drug that in, month is underneath of type, and what we get is we get our credit category and then when it's offered during the year. And this might be a good view if you're interested in an example for just taking A&A courses, when are those A&A courses listed? But what I want to see is what's the distribution over the months, right? So I'm just going to reverse these. I'm going to drag type under month, and I get a completely different view. And I can see that we have 8 hours of A&A and 32 hours of tax in January. And we can come down here and look in December. We have 130 total hours, and you can see what the breakout is. So again, very quick way to make sure that I've got coverage throughout the year versus this pivot chart, which shows me a very quick way to see if I have coverage throughout the state. But we're not done yet. One other question I need to look at is, what does the format look like? So I'm going to copy this again, and I'm going to paste it one more time, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take month out, I'm going to take type out, and I'm going to just bring format down here. So now what I get is a view of the course format. So conference is one format, live streams another format. Now this is a nice representation, but this is a place where a chart might be a little bit better. So while I'm in my pivot table, I'm going to click on Analyze, and I'm going to click Pivot Chart, and I'm going to choose a pie chart, and we hit OK. And now what we get is a pie chart of our total CPE by format. I'm going to change this top to be something more descriptive, CPE by format. And if you've used any of our other tutorials, you'll know that you can click on the paintbrush to get to a nice chart style. I'm going to scroll down and look for something that I like, and we'll click on this one. And this is going to show us that 60% of our CPE is in the seminar format type. And when you mouse over it, it tells you exactly that. And you can resize or move this chart any way that you would like. So we're going to move it over here. I'm going to make this bar smaller. And you can see that we can make that very large and very visible. And we know that 60% will be seminars, 5% will be conferences, 23% will be live streams, 6% are rebroadcast, 4% are from the Department of Revenue, and this little one down here are the 2% Department of Revenue live stream. So you can see what the entire catalog looks like and very quickly see what's distinct, where it's being offered, what month it's being offered, and the format type of the CPE. In under 10 minutes, we've completely changed how you consume that data, and that's the power of pivot tables.